Welcome back to the Mountain Flyer podcast. Mountain Flyer magazine is the mountain bike journal, and our podcast expands the magazine's print features, profiles, and discussions into yet another medium filled with personal insight and inspirational tales from our sport's celebrated personalities and gritty pioneers. I'm your host, Trina Ortega. Thank you for listening. If you like what you hear, please subscribe to the podcast, tell your friends, and support us via our online store at mountainflyer.com. This episode of the Mountain Flyer podcast is sponsored by Shimano. Thank you all for being part of this special edition of the Mountain Flyer podcast. I'm your host, Trina Ortega, and co-hosting with me today is Paul Andrews. We're excited for this podcast today because we've assembled a special group of luminaries from across the nation to discuss e-mountain bikes and e-mountain bikes in the U.S. mountain biking landscape. I'd like to introduce Paul, our co-host for today, first. He is a career journalist based in Seattle who has written about mountain biking for nearly 3 decades and in such diverse publications as the Seattle Times and MTBR.com. When Paul and I first started discussing this topic, e-bikes, rad, bad, or just a fad, we didn't want to focus on whether or not e-bikes belong. For some communities, that's old news, right? Rather, we wanted to talk with our guests about how EMTBs have changed their relationship to mountain biking and to being on the trail. And if it has, maybe it hasn't, maybe you love it just as much as you always have. We wanted to examine the pros and cons of this segment and how trail advocacy groups are managing this growing population of users, among other questions. Our panelists are going to tackle these questions over the next 40 minutes or so. And with that, I'd like to introduce each of them. Ace Bollinger.
Present, here.
Yes, hi, Ace. Tell me how to pronounce the name of the city in Washington State.
You're not even going to give it a try, huh? I live in Wenatchee, Washington, which is, if you look at a map, we're about smack dab middle, halfway between Seattle and Spokane. Due to beliefs, we're kind of in a high desert area here. We live right on the Columbia River. Right this morning it was below freezing when we woke up, and snow should be coming away. So we don't get a whole lot of rain here, which it would be nice now. Our trails are a little dusty, but so live in Wenatchee, and you can put me in the rad column of things for e-bikes.
Okay, Ace. I understand you're the state's leading e-mountain bike.
Yeah, and I'll get even for Paul for saying that. Sometimes leading means that maybe you have one of the louder voices that seems to be heard over and over again. I've been an advocate for e-mountain biking for at least the last 5 years. I've owned a ton of e-mountain bikes, and I really think that is a stepping off tool to help get more people out in the mountains and enjoying the beautiful scenery that we have, all over our country. Basically, more miles and more smiles.
All right, great. And people can find Ace on the PNW MTB e-bike group on Facebook.
That is correct. We are almost 1,000 members strong. We have members from BC, Alberta, Idaho, Montana, Oregon, Washington. I think we probably even have a few sprinkled in California, and maybe even Colorado. I don't know.
All right. Thanks, Ace. Leslie Kmar, thank you. It's good to see you again.
Thank you.
I wanted to pull from your bio, Leslie, which I thought was really sweet. When Leslie was a kid, her parents gave her 3 things that were integral to her life today: a camera, a bicycle, and a love for travel. About 14 years ago, Leslie quit her traditional job, sold most of her things, and rode her bicycle around the world. How awesome is that? That experience taught her that she was better at sleeping in a tent than sitting at a desk. Leslie is a full-time storyteller, photographer, and filmmaker. Her work has been featured in Outside and Free Hub magazines, and she works with commercial clients like Patagonia and Shimano. And Leslie, I just saw your cool piece in Mountain Flyer as well about hitting the spots in between all of the mountain bike hubs that we all know and love. It was really excellent.
Thanks, Trina.
Yeah. Thanks for being here, Leslie.
Thank you.
Yvonne, nice to meet you. I have
nice to see you. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah. Yvonne Kraus is the executive director of the Evergreen Mountain Bike Alliance in Washington State. Evergreen is the nation's largest regional mountain bike organization with more than 8,000 members. And it's actively working with stakeholder groups and public officials to set forward-looking e-mountain bike policy across multiple trail jurisdictions. And I really appreciate your voice as a trail advocacy member, Yvonne. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Nat, it's good to see you again.
Thank you, Trina. Thanks for Mountain Flyer for hosting the Out of the Box EMTB crowd with all of the advocates online as well as riders.
Yeah. Nat, your bio was hard to narrow down. Of course, you've been racing for 3 decades. You're a Hall of Famer, and I've known you for quite a while. But also, we should mention that you were a competitive skier as well. And through that, you have worked in a variety of settings in both the mountain bike industry and the ski industry. Nat is the founder and CEO of the Pro Bike Center and Tough Guy Productions, has worked with media and film crews, and is a natural storyteller known for bringing out the best in people. As a professional cyclist, Nat earned 4 world championship titles, 3 national championships, won Race Across America twice, and was inducted into the Hall of Fame in 2008.
Thanks, Trina. But I think the most important piece for all of us to know is the stewardship component that is related to e-bikes as we all face these new challenges. So I, like the rest of your team on this panel, have joined forces on the education realm now.
All right, great. Well, again, thank you all for being here. And some of you have touched on e-bikes a little bit and your relationship to them. Let's start, of course, by telling us how you each got into e-mountain biking. Maybe even if you want to jump back briefly and talk a little bit about mountain biking in general, and then how you got into e-mountain biking and when. And Leslie, can you kick us off?
Sure. I'd say I want to go in the Wayback Machine. I started riding mountain bikes in, oh man, like 1993. And it's like one of the best things I've ever done in my life. So getting into e-bikes was interesting because I was just leaving my work with IMBA, the International Mountain Bike Association. It was 2016, and I had the opportunity to collaborate with People for Bikes and Morgan Lomley, who was heading up the e-bike initiative there. And so I got into e-bikes through advocacy work. So I created what I think is maybe the first database of EMTB friendly routes. And then I was also doing some outreach with land agencies. So basically getting land managers demo bikes so that they could have firsthand experience with e-bikes as we were beginning this process of moving through e-bike policy, or at least figuring out how to navigate that policy and access for EMTBs on, federal lands all the way down to municipal agencies. And I would say I was resistant to riding e-bikes then, thinking that I was fit enough to ride my mountain bike. So why would I ride this e-bike? But I had to ride e-bikes for my work in advocacy and discovered that they're really, really fun. And why would you not want to have fun on a bike? Which led me to ride them more. And then last summer, I really dove in to riding e-bikes on big adventures and pushing the limits. And I've got a group of friends that we devised these, weeks, days upon days of riding e-bikes. And, I've started storytelling around it. So I'm definitely a big advocate for it. And I love them for pushing my limits when it comes to adventure riding.
Great. Thank you, Leslie. Yvonne?
So I have not yet adopted an e-bike, but my work requires me to deal on the advocacy front on e-bike riding and understand what our community desires and what the impacts of e-bikes are on the land, just as Leslie mentioned. What are the land manager policies and requirements and regulations around it? However, I grew up riding in the mountains. This was a long time ago, 1970s. Where, of course, I wasn't on a mountain bike yet. I was on a kid's bike, but I rode in the mountains with my family in Bavaria and Austria. And so mountain biking is in my blood. I haven't made the switch yet. Just as Leslie mentioned, I feel like I'm still fit enough to ride a regular bike. I've ridden e-bikes a whole lot. I understand their place and their desired and the fun factor. And what it means for our community and being comprehensive in how we design and build trail and negotiate and advocate for access. So that's my role in this. I do like riding them. I just haven't made the switch yet. My background is really in racing. That's how I got into mountain biking, and I understand the barriers to our sport that exist for many, many people. They may not exist for me physically or ability or fitness wise, but as a community and being inclusive, this is how our industry and our sport is innovating and developing. So my role is really to understand the landscape and make sure that that part of our community is represented and has places to go.
Great, thanks, Yvonne. Nat, how about you continue your story about how you got into e-bike?
Well, like Yvonne said, in Europe, they're very progressive, especially in her home country of Austria. So fortunately, throughout my racing and travels in 2010, I saw a gentleman on a mountain bike that was going uphill, track them down several days later. And the bike company was called Ego. And it was a kit that attached to the bike, which was technically, in my mind, the beginnings of the e-bike interest. With a battery pack that you wore with your hydration, and then an umbilical cord down to it. So the Austrians were onto something. This guy, Danny there, had the Ego kit that attached, so you could have a normal acoustic bike, or you could attach the battery to the motor. And in that process, turned me on to the backcountry access or the exploration mode and kind of opened my eyes. So kind of in 2011 were my first kind of MTB, in my mind, experiences.
Great. Ace.
Well, my story's certainly not as interesting as Leslie's or Nate's, but real briefly, about 5 years ago, a buddy of mine and I were riding up at a local trail, Squilchuck State Park, which is a great, got mostly greens and a few blues, and we were on a Sunday morning going to go for a ride on our acoustical bikes. We didn't know there was any difference at that point. And as we're unloading, I look up and I'm like, well, that's a tent here. I wonder what's going on. And it was a pivot tent. And one of the local dealers here in town, Scott Patton, came down and said, hey, why don't you guys try an e-bike? Yeah, no, we're fine. We don't need an e-bike. We're just going to ride for an hour or so. We don't need. And I don't want to say that he drug us down and twisted our arms, but kind of felt that way. And we're like, well, let's go appease him because he's a hell of a nice guy, and let's go on these bikes. So they got us all spit up on these 2 pivots, and we took off and started climbing hills. And boy, we were able to talk, and we were able to giggle and laugh, and we came back and just went, okay, it's just like the light was, the switch was flipped. It was like, the angels singing in the background. It was like, oh, well, mountain biking needs to be fun, or should be fun. And was built like a linebacker. I'm in the Clydesdale, maybe the super Clydesdale division. And so, I'm getting closer to 50 than 40. And so for me, I'm a self-employed general contractor. I needed to be at the jobs every day. And when I was up riding my bikes, I was always the last one, right? I was riding caboose. I was sitting there, I'll be sweep, whatnot. And I would sit there and, when actually you're either going up a hill or down a hill. And most of the time we got to go up before we go down. And it's not flat stuff. And we're climbing, anywhere from 1,500 to 2,000 feet to what we want to get up to do. And I'd come up huffing at the very, where everybody was stopped. Well, most of the fit riders had been there for 10 or 15 minutes. So they were ready to go. So they'd take off, boom. And so I would sit there, everybody take off. And I was sitting there, my heart rate was above 150. I had sweat coming out of my eyeballs. And I'm sitting there like, well, if I want to keep up, I've got to ride right now. And that's when I realized, with that e-bike is, hey, I could take the climbs to keep up with everybody else and enjoy the downhill. And you know what? Get invited to more rides with more people. Instead of, oh, well, Ace is coming. Well, shit, what are we going to do now? We're just going to be waiting. Now it's like, oh, hey, this is a great time. And you know what? He's got a big backpack. Maybe we'll even throw a few beers in there and he'll carry them up to the top. So yeah, it's, like I said, it was like a light was switched. And I started my love affair with e-bikes, and I don't know how many I've owned since then, but I one seems to follow me home every about 4 or 5 months, and another one kind of goes away. And I've got a full powered Levo right now. I've got a lightweight Levo SL, and then I've also even have a specialized road bike, a Creo gravel grinder, which I love it. I put my Brooks saddle on there, tan sidewalls. It's so much fun. And when we go riding with the roadies, I can sit there and I'm when there's a good wind blowing, I'm the most popular guy there because we're able to do 18 miles an hour and they're able to draft off me, and it's a great it's just a great equalizer. So anyways, I know I've taken way too much time.
Quickly, you mentioned your bikes, Ace. Nat,
Yes.
Leslie, tell us what your e-mountain bikes are, or other.
Well, I was going to say right now, actually, I didn't own an EMTB until this year, and I use it a lot in my photography work. But since bike supply was limited, I basically called up a shop one day and I was like, do you have any e-bikes that are small? And they said, yeah, we have 2. And I said, I'll be right there. And I ended up with a specialized Levo, the alloy version, which I was happy for because it was in my price range. But I've ridden other EMTBs, like the Santa Cruz Heckler is what I was on last summer. So I'm a specialized person for the moment, but I'm always open to riding whatever.
I'll piggyback on the Levo experience as well, since that seems to be a widely marketed bike and then highly accessible. The Specialized Levo has multiple sizes, and there's quite a few of them in my garage that I like to turn friends onto or guests when they're in town. And like Leslie said, kind of a great tool for anybody that's carrying anything into the backcountry, whether you're working on the trails, checking out trails, or just even accessing and riding them. So the equalizer, something that Ace said, a great component of the e-bikes is they bring the groups together so that the folks can talk and have a normal conversation like you would if everyone were fit, where the e-bikes can make that person accessible to the conversation as a normal rider in the group. So specialized Levos all the way. That's what I race at the World Championships and the World Cups. For me, the Levo platform's great since I'm a mountain biker.
Thanks for that, Nat. I wanted to ask you what your typical outing looks like. Are you with other e-mountain bikers, acoustic riders? And then how has that changed since you started? Are there more, fewer? Do people still heckle you, etc.?
Yeah, I think the great thing about everyone on this panel is that we are accessible for new riders to ask the questions and then share those experiences. So I find a lot of times I'm taking out the first users, if especially since a lot of demo bikes have not been available either through the local retailers or through events. So that, like where I'm at in Arkansas, even the Arkansas state parks, you can ride e-bikes. So it's a lot more between a soft surface and hard surface terrains. It's a lot more accessible in Arkansas than a lot of other places. So I find myself riding a lot of times, even if it's with the kids, the NICA kids, or just kids that ride in the area, the trail kids. A lot of the coaches a lot of times are on e-bikes, or if I'm taking a new crowd out, let's say it's somebody that has to sit behind a desk more than they would like, but does enjoy the bicycle, the e-bike's been a great tool for them to be able to still enjoy the trails. So it also in the adaptive realm as well, there's a lot of adaptive riders that have the motor on the bike so that they can actually pedal. And I do ride with some adaptive riders as well. So the e-platform is just opening up more experiences for people.
Right. And I also heard people who are limited on time. They might be fit, but they can just cover more ground and get to more single track more quickly. Yvonne, you still ride your regular mountain bike primarily, it sounds like. What's it like when you go out, say with all your buds who still ride regular mountain bikes, but have you had that experience where you go out on an e-mountain bike or maybe a mixed group?
Yeah, I'll share two quick stories. I recently spent some time in Moab. I hadn't been there in a while, and I joined a family with two little kids, the grandparents and the parents, and we rode every day together. So the age range in our group was from the youngest one was 9 to in his 70s, grandpa. And we all rode together. So again, equalizer is the word here so far. But you know, you can bring out the whole family and have an experience where maybe grandpa doesn't have the fitness anymore, but he has the skill level for the technical skills. And the 9-year-old was the fittest of all, right? He was riding up front and he wanted to have point. And so just being able to share the trails together was wonderful, and to be able to ride as a family was wonderful. In my daily riding, you know, I mostly still ride non-e-bike bikes, and so do many of my friends. But there is really not any conflict or issue that I notice on trails. We'll get to this a little later, I assume, but there's mostly a concern of perceived conflict. Just as Nat mentioned, our state parks recently opened their trails to e-biking. That happened about 1.5 years ago, I believe, and there was a lot of concern about conflict that would happen that ended up not happening. Enforcement officers who gave us reports back through e-bike committee meetings mentioned specifically that they really haven't seen any issues. And so now other land managers are evaluating. The biggest challenge that I'm encountering is actually not within the mountain bike community anymore, although there are some diehard no e-bike folks that I also represent, right? So that's where I have to navigate the advocacy landscape. But overall, most of the concern and the perceived conflict on the trail comes from the environmental organizations, the equestrians, and the hikers. And what does it mean when our sport changes? The mountain bike sport is not shy for innovation, right? And we tend to push new technology and try new things and keep the sport fun and let it evolve. And so the question is, when and how does that evolution become no longer compatible with the other users on the trail? And that's what we have to figure out. And that's where I believe, as Nat mentioned, Austria, Germany, other places in the world, New Zealand, have had more success in that than we have had here in the United States.
Yeah, Trina, if I can interject one thing that really changed my mind. I was actually a skeptic of e-bikes for many years, probably till about a couple of years ago. Primarily because I rode with folks who were either not interested or actively anti-e-bike, old schoolers, you know. I mean, I've been riding for 30 years and it was basically most of the folks I knew went back to the origins of mountain biking in this region, and they were set on maintaining the ethic. But, you know, one of the reasons I'm glad that Yvonne and Ace are on this panel is because I look to them as influencers in changing my mind. Ace is just, you know, he's an infectious guy. He's easy to listen to, and he's just a big presence, and he's got me essentially to consider the other side of things. And then Yvonne invited me onto a e-bike committee for Evergreen that is looking at policy and is trying to help come up with a policy for multiple jurisdictions. And she exposed me to a whole lot of other e-bikers. I mean, everybody on this committee, I think there's about 20 members, isn't that right, Yvonne? They're all pretty active e-bikers. So it kind of got me thinking, well, maybe there's something to this. And I had demoed e-bikes, wasn't really impressed with them, but the Specialized Turbo Levo and Pro and S-Works that came out, I paid attention to those reviews and they were pretty amazing. So I ended up getting a Turbo Pro and have a lot of fun with it. I do a lot of video work, a lot of photography, and I do a lot of trail work. And in both those cases, you're carrying a lot of gear that you wouldn't normally carry on a mountain bike ride. And I like to go long distances, and I like to do recon on places that aren't really well ridden. And the e-bike really helps in those cases because you don't really know what you're getting into, but you know you can always double back if you get into trouble. And the e-bike will help get you home before dark. So that's the place in it. I find I ride about once out of every 4 rides. I do an e-bike, and partly that's to keep the e-bike tuned. You know, you need to keep it going. But it has changed my thinking in a lot of ways about mountain biking and the sport. And influencers are important. I mean, influencers like Ace and Yvonne and other people who I respect and really can make a good case, I think can change people's minds.
Certainly. And I would imagine, Nat, you're finding that as well. Leslie, you're an influencer out there.
Yeah, I think, you know, when I first got into e-bikes, I was really focused on the advocacy side of things. And while I was doing that, I realized we had this great opportunity to just tell stories about people riding e-bikes. So, you know, like interesting people or sort of, you know, where to ride, and using e-bikes in different ways. And I was solely focused on that. Should they be allowed, or where are they allowed? And I think in the, you know, the years since 2016, and I've been involved in that, the storytelling side of e-bikes and getting the word out, I think is really helpful. And, you know, we're able to get away from the ideological conversation of, you know, are they okay, to, well, where can I actually ride this? And, you know, how can I dream about big adventures on an e-bike. So I think, influencing is important. And I think everybody on this panel has is important in doing that influencing in different ways.
Certainly. Nat, what would you add to that? Your longtime experience as an extreme sports racer, 3 decades running.
But I think for me, it's the component where we can talk about how it opens up the access and the ability to folks to explore the trails by bike again, especially on the mountain bike in the areas that the land agencies have allowed the access for the last couple of years. It brings so many more groups that experience that they have been not able to have, whether it's an individual rider that wants to get back into the sport or can get back into the sport this way, or whether it's someone that's using the e-bike as a work tool or even commuting for those lucky enough to have soft surface trails to commute to work on, as opposed to always having to be hardcore. So I still race all bikes, but these days, being 50, I like to have the e-bike as another competitive realm. So I do still have a lot of friends that are completely on the racing front, discredit the e-bikes, which racing's a whole other format, but at least for the purposes of what the e-bike in general is for these days, it's a great tool, and it's easy for me to share that experience with others and help educate them.
Right. And Ace, it sounds like you've been an influencer, and your infectious personality has probably rubbed off on some people.
You can't fight a force of nature like Ace.
All right.
Yeah, I'll get even with you, Paul. Don't worry about that. So.
I think, Paul, Yvonne started touching on our next sort of set of questions and discussion topic, if you want to segue into that.
Okay. I'm unsure which ones you were referring to.
I think a little bit of the attitude in everyone's region, and then how you're seeing agencies navigate what to open, how to open to e-bike access.
Yeah, I think Yvonne's in a delicate position. I don't know exactly how she does it, but she has to juggle the interests of both sides, and that cannot be easy. There is still in the Northwest a strong anti-e-bike sentiment among, like I say, old schoolers, or people who, I find it particularly among people who kind of like have worked really hard to develop their own trail networks in around their riding area, and feel kind of a proprietary relationship, and they think that e-bikes are going to destroy that. So you've got that on the one hand, and then you've got pretty evangelical people like Ace and other folks who are pushing hard for e-bike access, and Evergreen's in the middle because it has memberships on both sides. With that, I'll let Yvonne talk more about it, but it is an interesting situation.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. Trina, I'll dive right in if that's okay with you. That's exactly where I find myself, in the middle, right? So we actually developed and just completed 2 simultaneous processes. One was an internal e-bike committee that we had within Evergreen with advocates for access, e-bike access, and evaluating what was happening on a statewide committee level, where we had more than 20 participants from conservation orgs, other recreation groups that were non-motorized. We had 1 motorized representative on that panel as well. We had hunters, we had the state agencies on board, and we talked about the implications of e-bike access, the where, what, and how we deal with that on a state agency level, on the public land managers. And in the end, even though there was an enormous amount of alignment within both groups of what we think is a sustainable access policy, in the end, the very last meeting, there were too many fears amongst the statewide other recreation groups to fully sign on to e-bike access in a certain way that we thought was going to be sustainable and workable and doable and good to go in the long run and would make everybody happy. It was very tough to find the buy-in, and we had to soften our approach to it again. On paper, most people were aligned to Class 1 access on multi-user trail and a no-brainer for any trail that has a bike priority management objective. However, the fear for what that technology does and exactly why we like it, the fun factor, the equalizer, and the more access is a concern for tribes. More access and more use is a concern for wildlife organizations. And more access is a concern for the land managers who are already pressed for and resource constraint from managing the land and managing trail maintenance. So it's a problem both ways, right? And that's been a real interesting challenge. We do have some solid outcomes, and there will be a recommendation that land managers hopefully can find helpful. But ultimately, I see our role as providing the land managers with a solution to e-bike access that is currently a problem for them. And it's our responsibility to make that problem go away. And we need to find alignment amongst all recreational trail users on what our innovation does to their user experience, their trail experience. And so that's where we're trying to find sort of a soft entry. And then hopefully over time, those concerns, those fears, just by the fact that the technology will become ubiquitous and actually is not creating conflict, I hope that that evolution leads to more access. Maybe not all 3 classes, but more access overall. It's just taking time. There's a fear. But I'll share one more thing in that ultimately also almost everybody within that committee process on both sides voiced that it's not necessarily the technology that's the issue, it's the way the user chooses to actually use that technology on the trail. And as a mountain bike community, we do not necessarily set the right example in many places. We're riding in places where we're not allowed to, and we are riding against directional trail recommendations because now your e-bike allows you to do that. That causes a conflict. So as long as we behave and as long as we utilize the technology where it's appropriate and allowed, I don't see any issues. If we start abusing the technology because we can now access places where we couldn't prior, but we're not technically out there yet, that's what's causing the brakes on the agencies, and that's what's causing the fire amongst equestrians, conservation organizations, and the hikers, because we are changing the user experience and we're not following the rules. And so that was one thing that was shared by quite a few.
And Yvonne, specifically on that, the thrust early on was to open trails to e-bikes that were not specifically signed prohibiting e-bikes. And we thought that that was something we could bridge among the various user groups. But Yvonne, explain how that changed. Was it the land managers essentially not feeling like they were losing control in terms of posting, or was it more of a groundswell of sentiment by mountain bikers themselves or hikers or environmentalists? How did that get changed?
Yeah, there's a couple of things. There's the concern of e-bikes being lumped in with regular mountain bike use. And there was language written within the draft policy at the state level that if e-bikes were introduced and then a trail or other users decided that that use was not sustainable or appropriate on that trail could be closed by bikes. And that's where I raised my hand and said, we cannot allow that to happen to our sport. So e-bikes must be under a separate management objective. They need to be seen as separate from regular analog mountain bikes so that our access to multi-use non-motorized trails is never threatened. The only thing we try to do, Paul, and I'm not sure if I'm answering your question there exactly, but what we're trying to do is move from a closed unless signed open environment, which is what the current preference is, to an open and less sign closed environment, because there's so many more practical ways in terms of signage and how we identify access if we go that route. That's what the land managers nor any of the other stakeholders, they were not ready for this. So to just simply adopt them as bikes allowed anywhere on non-motorized trails, there was no appetite for that. So we are still operating in a policy development environment where trails are closed to e-bikes unless they are specifically signed open for them. And that's what we're currently doing a number of pilots on. But again, hopefully over time, those fears will disappear. But that's again where we're navigating the concerns amongst other user groups and the impact of you ride twice as many miles, but you're not doing more maintenance work parties as a result. You're riding deeper into the wilderness, so there's a wildlife impact that's not being considered. And if you're talking with an agency like the Department of Fish and Wildlife, that is a #1 priority and concern for them. So the equalizer and the fun factor is not of importance to them. For them, it's wildlife protection, and are we bringing more people onto the land, further into the land, where wildlife used to not see many users and now users are coming in. That's also a big difference between Austria, Switzerland, Germany, and New Zealand, for example, where we have more wild lands and we have prioritized protection of those lands versus Austria, which has prioritized recreation and access.
Sure. Yvonne, there were no trails in your area, though, again, in the Pacific Northwest, Evergreen. There were no trails that were actually closed, like previously open to mountain bike. Then the e-bike situation came on and concerns were raised.
No,
you were able to.
No, we are in the middle of policy development. That policy was proposed, and that's where we said, well, wait a second, we couldn't be in that potential position where a trail that was open to biking now gets closed because they have deemed our sport of mountain biking to be no longer compatible with the other users on the trail. And that's a risk that we can't take.
Right, and that has been a concern raised by other mountain bike community members, right, who are concerned about what a growing e-bike population might mean to all bike access. And so I think it does seem like a valid concern, and it sounds like groups like Evergreen are working on that. Is there another organization that Evergreen looks to that has either done some modeling, had some successes?
Yeah, well, I'll let Paul and Ace talk about this a little bit as well. I work with IMBA directly on e-bike policy and look at what's happened elsewhere to identify what works. I work with People for Bikes, and they were invited to our committee process as well. We worked with the industry through that committee process and it identified why and what is working in Europe and why is that not working here, right? And what are the differences? So we're looking all over the place. We've been working on this for years. Obviously, we're not moving fast enough, but the reality is just a little different here compared to the rest of the world. And we have some significant tribal concerns in Washington State about the number of users on the land to begin with. So when we're talking about adding more use, creating more infrastructure to accommodate a new sport or a new variation of the sport, that's just always going to be a very nuanced policy discussion, and we have to find common ground. The biggest challenge that I'm running into is that the 3-class system that we've adopted in the United States opens the door to more powerful motors on our trails that do not exist in Europe, and I don't believe exist in New Zealand either. And that is a challenge that we're dealing with, that again, that enforcement and where the technology goes, our parameters or our 3-class system could potentially open the door to larger motors, way more power than you need to have fun on a mountain bike. And so if we can somehow restrict it to the Levo model, a smaller motor, I think most of those fears would be gone, but the current legislative environment allows for a larger motor, and there's a lot of concern for that.
Yeah, when you talk about other places to look for leadership, it's ironic a little bit, but it's also telling. As part of the project that Yvonne mentioned for Evergreen and EMTB, I pulled a lot of land managers in Washington State. And when I'd call them and ask them what their e-bike policy was, the first question they'd ask me is, well, what does Evergreen think? What's Evergreen's policy? So there is this kind of symbiotic relationship, and it speaks to the leadership of Evergreen that it's well known enough and respected enough that the land managers themselves would look toward Evergreen and toward the mountain biking community for leadership on this issue.
Yeah, if you don't mind jumping in here, it's kind of touching back on what Paul said about, there's, people that are against e-bikes and whatnot. I think that's more geographical than anything else. Over on the east side of the mountains here, e-bikes and acoustical bikes, we ride together. We plan rides together. We have fun together. I've never had anybody on the trails say anything bad about me riding an e-bike ever. And I know there's a lot of people that get flippant comments and whatnot, but over here it's it's not too bad in Spokane and into Idaho around Coeur d'Alene. The people I've talked to, they don't have any issues with it. Same thing with BC up there. On BC, Class 1 mountain bikes are allowed everywhere, and it's socially accepted. So I think, you start getting around that 206 Seattle metro area. And yeah, I mean, you guys are, packing you're packing a lot of people into tight areas where, we have a little bit more room out here to stretch and grow. And I can empathize with the land managers, but they also got to realize that they're managing those lands for us. We own the lands, the people do. We pay taxes on those. And if we decide, oh, hey, this is maybe what we want to do, there needs to be a quick, decisive path to that. The Forest Service they've never been fast. And it's one of those deals where, they're in activity and their unwillingness to weigh in on things or let Class 1 bikes go is making criminals out of a lot of us because we're trespassing, and I don't like to do that. I like to pay my fair share and do things as legally as possible. But we don't. I've never seen a park ranger on the trails over here. I've never seen anybody from the Forest Service. I've never had, in all the times in central Washington here, and then by the Spokane area, never seen anybody on the trails, right? Never have I been asked or checked or anything else like that. And I'm sure over in Seattle, if I was to fire up my Levo and go ride a Doothy, I'm sure I'd probably get a few comments here and there on why I should be riding there. So, but yeah, geographical, maybe in areas where people are a little more laid back, they're more widely accepted.
Yeah, I think part of it might be, Ace, that it's population. It's just like we have so many more people over here in such a smaller space. In Bellingham, almost an international destination. No e-bike riding anywhere in Bellingham. There is a state park up there you can ride, but the target area of Galbraith Mountain essentially is run by mountain bikers. I mean, they have jurisdiction over the area, and they're against e-bikes on Galbraith. So part of it is just the dynamic is just when you get so many more people on a limited space, I think the potential for conflict and disagreement rises.
Hey, I want to chime in, folks, and say, like, in my experience with the land agency perspective, I think when you look at the federal level, I think it's not a lack of trying. They just have these processes that take forever to change policy. So the Forest Service and the BLM, they're not as agile as, say, like a city or county is. And I think, my experience, I live part-time in Colorado and part-time in East Tennessee and Knoxville, Tennessee. And that's a place that adopted MTB friendly policies right away, because it was on a city and county level as opposed to a federal level. So Ace, I totally hear you in that frustration, but I think it's important for the listeners to know that it's unfortunate that our federal government has these long drawn out processes that that have to be followed. And I think I would agree it does force people into doing things that, you know, they want to go and have fun. They don't necessarily want to wait 5 years for a management plan to come out.
Yeah, thanks for that point, Leslie. And
I've talked to a lot of land managers, and it's not the land managers. I mean, it's the system, like Ace says. The land managers themselves, I really think they don't care, or they say, hey, we're here for everybody. And so they're not the sticking point. It's much more of the machinery.
I'd
For
like
sure.
to jump in as well. Nat, you mentioned Arkansas State Parks allowing access. Can you talk about the process there, and have you been involved directly in some of that?
Right. So honestly, in Arkansas, I was in Colorado when the Arkansas pieces were going through the Arkansas State Parks, where Monument Trails was formed as a wing to kind of grow the expansion of the soft trail surfaces and the experiences from the trailhead for different user groups within an easy network. Not overnighters or anything like that, but just an accessible way. So the monument trails were the initial first steps for Arkansas State Parks to find out how to share user experiences with the hikers, the trail runners, and not as many equestrian user groups in Arkansas. And then the Arkansas Parks and Recreation Foundation came through and really started going through the Arkansas State Parks and identifying user experiences that would identify with their already mountain bike trail networks, but create expansions and also allow those experiences for riders of all abilities or groups in that as well. So it started at the Arkansas State Parks, then Monument Trails started getting really involved, and then the Arkansas Parks and Recreation Foundation is truly the ones that are growing the user experience here in Arkansas for e-bikes and for just the stewardship component and opening up advocacy, doing some education pieces as well, so that riders are aware of all the user groups on the trails and their experiences are kind of one and the same, where everyone is a little bit more respecting of the trails or the other user groups on the trails simultaneously.
And it sounds like that, broadly speaking, that education component, whether you ride an acoustic mountain bike or an mountain bike, we still need that, and that still is an important strand of all of our work.
I will say, yeah, just from the Arkansas perspective, there's less users and more new users. So it has been easier with the education component for the Arkansas Parks and Recreation Foundation to come in and speak to the user groups because we don't have the masses, and a lot of the users are now new users or reintroduced perhaps through the e-bike. So it is that education component. It still has to be worked out in a lot of realms, but that is part of the success story in Arkansas.
Okay, Nat, I'm sorry. Can you tell us describe Monument Trails briefly and what that is?
Yeah, and really, I'm not the right one to describe the monument trails per se as like an Amber Brown or one that works for monument trails directly. They know their roles and their lanes. I'm just familiar with the way that they have the park structure set up and how they're rolling into the different parks. And locating areas in Arkansas that are near communities that could benefit mountain biking and also mountain bikes on those trails. So I would encourage them to visit the Arkansas Parks and Recreation Foundation or Monument Trails websites. Since I don't specifically work for them, I don't want to speak out of tone.
Sure. Thank you for that synopsis, though. Guide people to where to go online to find out more information. Yeah, I'm gonna check the time. We are at 5:03. Do you all still have just a few more minutes?
Yep.
Sure.
Okay. Paul, do you have any questions you would like to bring up? I know I've kind of dominated the question portion of it, but if you have some questions that you've been
Yeah, I'd be curious about one thing. Where are we headed? I think is interesting to me in terms of access and usage. The fad part, I think we all agree that it's not a fad, but I threw that out to be a little provocative because I have run into folks longtime mountain bikers who have they've owned e-bikes and then sold them. They haven't, it hasn't caught with them. And so I question them, I say, why? And they give various reasons, weren't using them enough. But I think it kind of boils down to the fact that for them, it's a different sport. And that's, to me, probably one of the main questions I have in terms of moving forward. Are we going to consider e-bikes and mountain bikes as lumped in together as one activity, one sport? Or will it evolve into kind of separate avenues like cross-country skiing and downhill skiing, or jet skis and kayaks, or to use another example? In other words, appealing to a different kind of mentality. I'd be interested in seeing what people think along those lines. Ace, what do you think? What do you say to that?
Well, that is a good question, Paul. I really don't know, and I know that I sit there and I kind of ponder that and go back and forth in that in my mind. But yeah, I don't really have the answer to that right yet, to be honest with you.
It's interesting.
I can jump in if you want. I'll try to make 2 quick points. Where we headed in terms of our policies and where land managers are and what we want to see is absolutely a separate management objective, even though that comes with its issues and challenges. We need to do everything we can to prevent our sport from becoming treated as a motorized sport. And the Forest Service is very close to making a decision on their approach. And their approach right now, as it is proposed, is that if e-bikes are allowed on a non-motorized trail, and it is determined that that use is okay, that trail officially becomes a motorized trail. It's only open to e-bikes, so it doesn't mean that other motorized uses can join, but it's allowed for e-bike use. It is then changed in its process to a motorized trail designation, which means my non-motorized trail maintenance funding is no longer applicable to that trail. And that is a very, very, very scary thing. So we as a community need to do everything we can to work with, encourage, and collaborate to make sure that the sport stays non-motorized. And then second, with industry pushing, we need the industry help to responsibly sell the product, right? And I think we also need to realize as a group that we tend to think in the mountain bike realm. E-bike technology is not a mountain bike issue. And so that again goes back to the threat of the motorized sport. When we start seeing other user groups adapting e-bikes to get access to the land in Washington State, that is significantly happening with the hunting community at the moment. And you see bikes that look like motorcycles that are completely converted to haul out wildlife, their catch, to the lay person's eye, that is a motorcycle on a non-motorized trail. And so while we work in the mountain bike realm and sort of, vision of this, e-bike technology is a non-motorized recreation issue. And so we can push for the mountain bike use, but we have to consider that whatever decision and whatever policy we adopt is way and goes way beyond mountain bike use. It is all recreation users. Kayakers can shuttle their kayaks up the river on the non-motorized trail now. Hunters can get into wildlife territory to hunt now, where they weren't before, right? So I think that's just one thing that in everything we do, we have to consider, and every mountain biker who wants to push for the technology and access needs to be aware of this. The last thing I'll say is, I'm making 3 points, I'm sorry, but to Ace's point of the regionality of it, absolutely. If there isn't any access for e-bikers, we must create it. It's not a fad, it needs to be created, right? So if you haven't gotten any e-bike access, we need to work hard to create it to a reasonable scale so people have a place to play and don't have to break the rules. If there is a whole lot of motorized trail access that is of reasonable quality to ride on an e-bike, and Ace lives in one of these places, the push for e-bike access can be a little less strong. And that just depends on where you live. Ace can ride a 20+ mile motorized trail system that mountain bikers love, and it's fantastic to do on an e-bike. It's called Devil's Gulch and Mission, right? That's a perfect example where Ace has access, yet in Bellingham, Seattle, Olympia, there are no motorized trails. So if you buy an e-bike, you got nowhere to go. And that's the reality. That's where I think our advocacy issues need to be prioritized.
Hey, Nat.
Sorry, Ace. we're coming to Wenatchee yet. You know what's happening, but it's going to be a little later.
Hey, Nat, what do you think? I mean, you've obviously ridden with both types of groups and both done racing in both arenas. Is there a different psychology? How do you think the sport will evolve?
Yeah, in the US, we still got so much more ground rules to kind of all follow together. So I really think that Yvonne was right in this, the educated front piece, where the more educated that we as stewards can help those, whether it's the agencies, the groups, or even just folks at trailheads, it's actually kind of even a general mountain bike interaction piece now, because a lot of mountain bikers are so new in general that some of the they were kind of called rules of the trail back in the day, and IMBA had stated kind of these ways to follow, let's say specifically even in NICA with the racers, they called it Spirit of Howdy, where NICA student athletes, when they encountered folks on the trail, would wave if they could and say hi to the other user groups. I think in general, if you are on an EMTB or e-mountain bike, it is nice to slow down and literally share those kind of early methods back again, so that we're all respectful of everybody on the trail, because EMTBs do go faster. Some folks even ride EMTBs with full face helmets. So it is not an approachable from the other user group's perspective. EMTB can really cause some damage out there when it takes just a couple moments at a trailhead to kind of everyone enjoy the surroundings and put it in perspective before they go out on their individual journeys. So I would say when we were saying, is it rad? Is it bad? Is it a fad? The bad part about EMTB and EMTB access is the fact that a lot of users are abusing just the speeds of the bikes themselves, or just not aware of the other users out there at the same time on the trail networks. So we do have a lot of work to do in general to keep the access that you guys have fought so hard for as just respecting all the trail users out there. So that's what I would sum it up as.
Yeah, one thing I find, I always apologize when I'm on out in, because basically you're not allowed, but e-bikes ride on trails. And when I'm on my e-bike, I always apologize. And I find that people really respond to that well. They all say, oh, you know, it's okay. Glad you're out here. Glad you're having a good time. On the other hand, if I feel defensive or I run into e-bikers who are defensive or glum or non-communicative, or they just want to pass you and get out of there. That puts people off. And so I think it's incumbent on the riders ourselves to essentially set a tone when we encounter other people, and not just other e-bike or other bikers, but other hikers and equestrians and everything. Just be friendly, be like Ace. I mean, welcome everybody, smile on your face, you're having a good time. And if most of the time people respond in kind to that.
That's the golden rule. Just be nice to everybody. Right? I mean, on the mountains at Costco, I mean, it wouldn't hurt to smile and nod or strike up a conversation with people. And, and what a great opportunity to do that at a trailhead or up in the mountains where you're enjoying this beautiful scenery and you're riding these awesome trails that were built for mountain bikes. And why not have a laugh or share a joke or just a pleasant how you doing, everything okay. I think if there's anything this pandemic has taught us is, what we need to be better neighbors to each other. And so I think you're right with that, Paul, that being good stewards of the land and being good stewards of e-biking is striking up that conversation and being friendly and whatnot. And, one good thing about riding an e-bike is I got a big backpack, and I carry shock pumps, I carry bike, you name it. And if someone, I always stop if someone's on the site. You guys need a hand? You need anything else like that? I might not be able to do the work, but I've got the tools if they need to. And it just kind of puts you in the everybody not so defensive, and everybody, oh, okay, well, he's riding e-bike, but he's not that bad of a guy.
It's telling good stories, Leslie style, right?
Yeah.
It's really telling the good stories and making sure that elected officials hear and experience those stories for themselves.
Yeah, I obviously agree with the storytelling, and I think that's a really approachable way to do the education and outreach that I think is still really important for e-biking.
Yeah, definitely.
I can't think of a better way to end our conversation. I appreciate all the work you all are doing on the advocacy front, of course, but I also appreciate you all being here today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Trina.
Thanks for being here.
Been great.
Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.
See you.